An ongoing civil war in Libya is fueling chaos, despair, and a devastating migrant crisis. People trying to flee Africa for Europe are getting trapped in Libya, where they are facing brutal conditions like slavery, murder, beatings, torture, and rape. Now, the European Union is working with the Libyan Coast Guard to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea. But many end up in detention centers. BBC News correspondent Stephanie Hegarty spoke with some survivors who just returned home to Nigeria.
Many of those who've walked the streets of Benin have dreamed of going to Europe. Jackson and Felix almost made it. But they were arrested in a boat off the coast of Libya and sent to prison in a place called Garian.
Before they sent me as a slave in the prison, I witnessed close to 10 deaths. The Mudi that used to guard us, which is the Arabu man, he came at the night, he now counted 20 of us.
Take us to the farm. I work for a farm, harvest onions. We walk, no food, sometimes
They said when they were no longer needed, they were dumped in the desert, rescued by a man driving by. They were repatriated to Nigeria with the help of the UN. We spoke to several Nigerian migrants, cross-checking the details of their stories, and each told us of the same horrifying trend. Prison authorities leasing or selling migrants to local businesses as labour. It's a new development in a dark and brutal industry in which traffickers and prison guards extort migrants, forcing them to buy their freedom.
There were a connection man there that normally have the connection to the Mudi, that's the director of the prison. He will call them and he will beat them out.
Mak Agayere was arrested in Libya in 2015 and brought to prison in a town called Zawiya.
In that 5 months, God now used a man. I thought it was my Messiah. I never knew he's a bad person.
He says the man bought his freedom and forced him to work for nothing. After 3 months, Mak refused to continue.
They all called their brother. They now used barbed wire to tie my hand, tie my leg, and push me inside the car. And they now took me back to prison.
Back in prison, he was told he was going to be deported. Instead, he was taken to Garian for 7 months.
How many people did you see die there?
Almost 20 of them.
In this hotel in Benin City, about 200 men and women who've just arrived from Libya are being processed and received by the authorities here. Many of them have stories of abuse and mistreatment at the hands of the authorities in the Libyan detention centres where they were held. And at least 3 people that I've spoken to so far told me they were forced to work for free or sold as slaves.
Most times they come to our caravan, they pick like 6 persons, take them out to do their dirty jobs, the farming, the bricklaying works, to feed their cattle. They give us out to their friends. They take us to their house. They use us, they don't feed us. The information came to us that they told our Nigerian ambassadors that Nigerians are no more in the prison because they want to make money from us.
Again and again, Garian prison is mentioned as a place of terrible abuse. It's run by Libya's Ministry of Interior, which itself is run by 2 militia groups. Libya is in the middle of a civil war, and these militia are only nominally under the UN-recognised government in Tripoli. The Libyan Interior Ministry didn't respond to our attempts to set up an interview. The UN's migration agency says there are about 700,000 migrants still stuck in Libya. Several African governments have stepped up efforts to get their citizens home, and thousands have been repatriated in the past few weeks. Carrying untold trauma, those that do come home have to begin the hard work of rebuilding their lives.
And BBC News correspondent Stephanie Hegarty is with us now from Lagos, Nigeria. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us. The stories are compelling, they are disturbing. I'm wondering how you got the people that you interviewed, how you got them to tell their story. I mean, trust must have been an issue.
Well, because Nigerians are such a huge part, the majority of migrants who go through Libya are Nigerians. So we've been covering the story for a few years, and I've gotten in touch with a network of returnees. There have been people coming back over the past few years, but nothing like the amount that have come back in the past few months. So through this network, I set up some interviews. I was asking around to find out who had been through this kind of experience. And it was quite difficult to find people until recently, because with these mass repatriations that have been happening from Libya to Nigeria in the past few months, there have come a huge number of stories of this kind of abuse, this kind of slavery. And what's even more shocking than the stories themselves actually is the number of them that we're talking about here.
Right.
Stephanie, and I'm so happy for your reporting because it's a story that really needs to get out. There's been a lot of talk of other things, certainly here in this country, and this is so important because when you just called it slavery. It's essentially what it is, and I don't think that a lot of Americans realize the value that is placed on human life in these situations. In your reporting, you point out that when individuals are haggling over the price of a human being, we're talking about anywhere from only $600 to about $750 per person for a human being.
Yeah, maybe even less, because what seemed to be happening from the people I spoke to, what seemed to be most predominant, was that the people who ran detention centres were leasing migrants out as day labour. And of course, those two men I spoke to in the report, they were leased out for a long time, for about 6 months, and then of course just dumped to die. But this idea of people being leased out on a day-to-day basis, that I heard that story from at least 7 people I spoke to in that group who had just returned.
I know you spoke to one woman, reading sort of the written report, you spoke to one woman, but you said women rarely speak about this sort of thing. Can you tell me what the journey is like for a woman?
Well, there is a general difference that I've found in the trafficking journey for men and for women. For men, it's most often voluntary. They choose to go looking for work. But and there is crossover, some of the women do that as well, but quite a lot of the women will be trafficked. They'll be sent by a madam or by a trafficker to be involved in a prostitution ring. So there's a lot of sexual violence there, there's a lot of sexual exploitation, which of course for anyone is more difficult to talk about. But also, coming back, lots of these women will still be beholden to the traffickers that sent them. They'll be afraid, because the trafficking rings of course operate in Libya and in Nigeria. So they're coming home, but they may not be coming home to a safe environment. They may be facing the same people that sent them when they left.
And Stephanie, if you would provide to our viewers just an understanding of Nigeria as a country, why are so many seeking to escape a country that a lot of people realize has enormous natural resources? Nigeria has enormous oil reserves, gas reserves. What is the disparity there between the haves and the have-nots, and why are we seeing this sudden increase over the last couple of years of people attempting to leave the country?
Well, Nigeria is a rich country if you look at the super wealthy, but overall it's not. If you look at the GDP of Nigeria as a whole, it's still quite poor, and the average income, the minimum wage here is 18,000 naira, which is just about $35, $40, and that's a month. So this is a poor country, despite the super oil wealth that we've seen and the extremity of that wealth. So it's a purely economic choice for most of these people. They're not fleeing war, they want to go to a place where they can earn a lot more money and where they see much more opportunity. And many of the people that we've met are graduates, but they've come out of university at a time of economic crisis in Nigeria as well. Because of the drop in oil prices, this country is going through difficult economic times. They're coming out of college and they're not seeing any opportunities, and they think, we can get jobs in Europe, we can earn a lot more money, and we can send it home. And their predecessors, relations, friends have done that over the past 20 years or so. The reason why this is on the increase, of course, is because Libya is unstable, and for the past few years it's been easier to get to Europe. But that seems to be changing now.
As I was listening to the migrants in your story, I was trying to figure out whether it was worse to be forced into slavery or remain in the prison. The conditions in the prison sound horrific. Who oversees this? Is there any sort of intervention?
Well, Libya is a very fractured, divided country. So Garian, that prison that I mentioned in the report, that is technically overseen by the Ministry of the Interior. But the Ministry of the Interior is led by 2 militia groups who are only nominally under the recognized government in Tripoli. So that means there's very little general oversight. And with all this violence and volatility in Libya, it's easy to see how these human rights abuses happen, though the extent of the violence and the extent of the abuse is hard to understand.
Stephanie, speaking of accountability, the United Nations has attempted in some level or another to address this, specifically the apparent slave trade and the treatment of migrants in Libya back in November. Let's listen to what the Secretary General had to say.
I am horrified at news reports and video footage showing African migrants in Libya reportedly being sold as slaves. I abhor these appalling acts and call upon all competent authorities to investigate these activities without delay and to bring the perpetrators to justice. And I've asked the relevant United Nations actors to actively pursue this matter. Slavery has no place in our world, and these actions are among the most egregious abuses of human rights and may amount to crimes against humanity.
Stephanie, I mean, you know, I think perhaps it's commendable that the UN Secretary General had something like that to say. But during my time as a foreign correspondent in Nigeria, I know from your experiences, the UN, do they have any sort of pull in this situation? They, up until this point, have not been able to do that. We've seen this story repeated across the continent for many, many years.
Well, it's worth noting that the UN's migration agency, the IOM, are behind these mass repatriations. They're working in conjunction with the Nigerian government, but they've been funding these planefuls of people that are coming back to Nigeria, and they've been giving them a little stipend to help them start rebuilding their lives once they're back here. So they have been very active in that regard. As regards the meeting at the end of November, there were decisions made to impose sanctions on people who were involved in the slave trade. But if the trade is as pervasive as the stories that we heard seem to indicate, then it would be very difficult to impose sanctions on all of those people involved.
Stephanie Hegarty, thank you so much for joining us.
Credible reporting. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.